Hello and welcome to the latest seminar from the Glasgow Centre for Population Health, supporting new approaches to improve health and tackle inequality. In this videocast, Kezia Dugdale, Director of the John Smith Centre for Public Service at the University of Glasgow, delivers this keynote presentation exploring where good public policy and politics clash. 23 years of devolution and disappointment. It was recorded via Zoom on the 25th of May 2022.
Good afternoon to everyone, and a very warm welcome to the Glasgow Centre for Population Health seminar. This is our 18th series of seminars. My name is Bruce White and I'm a Public Health Programme Manager at the GCPH. It's my pleasure to be chairing the seminar today and to introduce our speaker, Kezia Dugdale. But before I introduce Kezia properly, I'll just run through some of the format for this afternoon. Kezia will speak for about 45 minutes or thereabouts, after which we'll have time for about half an hour, 40 minutes of questions and answers for Kezia. So thank you to those of you who submitted questions in advance. We'll do our best to cover these during the discussions, and you can also submit questions during and after the talk, but please do this via the Q&A function on your screens. If you'd like to tweet during and after the seminar, the webinar, please use the hashtag GCPHSEM18. A recording of the webinar, along with the presentation slides, will be made available on the GCPH website after the seminar, and all attendees will be sent a link to this when it's available. So, on behalf of GCPH, we're delighted to have Kezia Dugdale here today to talk to us on our chosen topic, where good public policy and politics clash, 23 years of devolution and disappointment, ? Kezia joins us from the John Smith Centre for Public Service at the University of Glasgow, and also from our hut in our garden. She studied law at the University of Aberdeen and completed a master's degree in public policy at the University of Edinburgh. She's a former Scottish politician, as I'm sure you know. She was a member of the Scottish Parliament for the Lothian region from 2011 to 2019 and served as leader of the Scottish Labour Party from 2015 to 2017. In 2019, she took up the position of Director of the John Smith Centre for Public Service at the University of Glasgow. She's a trustee of the children's charity Systema Scotland, the housing charity Shelter UK, and the oversight board of The Promise. So without further ado, I'll pass over to you, Kezia.
Thanks, Bruce, and it's lovely to be with everyone here today. I think it's really important to start by saying I've put a question mark at the end of this statement, and that question mark can apply to whether the public policy was the thing that got in the way, or whether it was the politics that got in the way, whether we actually are disappointed with devolution so far, or whether it was inevitable. And I'm just doing that deliberately to be provocative this afternoon. As you've already said, Bruce, I spent the best part of 10 years serving in the Scottish Parliament as a MSP for the Lothians region, and I spent 2 years of that in the leadership position in the Scottish Labour Party, where I was responsible for developing party political policy, if you like, as well as legislating within the Parliament. So I've seen policy development process from a number of different angles. And sorry, I'm just going to, a slight issue here with my screen. Hold on 2 seconds. Apologies for that. I want to make sure I can still see my notes and talk at the same time. Politicians aren't used to using PowerPoint, so bear with me. I'm trying to make my screen just a little bit smaller so I can see my notes as well. I don't know if you can help me with that, Bruce. It's just going automatically to full screen.
I'm not sure myself how you get around that, sorry.
Okay, we'll persevere. So yeah, so on the front page of this slide presentation, you can see a picture of myself and Nicola Sturgeon and Ruth Davidson, which was harking back to the 2016 and 2017 general elections, which I'm going to refer to a couple of times today, because I think in recent years, in the context of independence and the Constitution has really dominated much of our political debate at the expense of proper debates about public policy, proper debates about social policy, particularly on the domestic agenda. So what I'm going to do is spend the first half of this seminar talking a little bit about the political context, and then I'm going to spend the second half of the seminar really looking at two substantive policy issues in greater detail, after offering a bit of a reflection about what I think the successes of devolution have been up until this point. The two substantive policy areas that I have picked are housing and looked after young people. One is because Bruce has already said I now sit on the board of Shelter across the United Kingdom, and I chair its Scotland committee, so I've got a very strong and passionate interest in housing policy, and I believe that the right to a home is a critical part of tackling poverty, inequality, and ensuring that every person can achieve their full potential in life. And I think there has been some progress towards better rights when it comes to housing, better tenants' rights, better access to housing that have stemmed from devolution. But I think there's an awful lot of deeper structural and institutional reform that's required that politics gets in the way of. So I'm going to bring to you an argument as to why I think that's the case and what we can do about it. And the second big substantive issue is the standing of looked after young people in Scotland. So these are children who are brought up by the state in one form or the other, whether that be in residential care, whether that be in a kinship care setting, and whether that be with a foster parent or any other definition of what that might mean. And we're only talking here about 17,000 children across Scotland. It's 17,000 too many, of course, but I think it's a really good example of an issue which shouldn't be that hard to transform, but is exceptionally difficult because of how many different organisations and institutions are involved in the delivery of services for that particular cohort of young people. And I think it's a really good example of how difficult whole system change is, particularly when you have multi-levels of government. So I'm going to explore some of that as well. And then, of course, as Bruce has said, offer plenty of opportunities for people to ask detailed questions when we get to the end of that. So I come at this as a former politician, somebody who has an academic interest in policy, having done that as a master's before I entered politics, and now returning to academia in my role as the director of the John Smith Centre at the University of Glasgow. I want to say just a little bit about what the John Smith Centre is about, because I think one of the things that we focus on day to day when it comes to research is directly relevant to that issue, and that is the degree to which we trust our politicians, an issue that couldn't have been more topical or timely given the events of Partygate and the Prime Minister's statement to the House of Commons in the past hour or so. But first and foremost, the John Smith Centre is about making the positive case for politics and public service. And we try and do that through three core pillars of activity. We research the relationship between the people and their politicians, between people and their public servants. We advocate for politics as a force for good in the world, trying to encourage more people, more diverse people from different walks of life, to look at working in politics or in the civic society ecosphere that surrounds politics, people who are driven by a sense of public service, who believe in a common good and the public good, and want to shape that, need to believe that politics is a noble vocation, that it's a force for good. So we try and advocate for the very best of what that looks like in practice. And finally, the bit of the work that I'm perhaps most proud of is the internship and development programs that we run, encouraging young people and underrepresented people, particularly minority ethnic communities, to look at careers in public service, to look at careers in public life with paid, well-structured political internships and parliamentary internships and internships within the third sector. I think it's worth saying at the start, because a lot of what I will say will come across as very political over the next half an hour or so. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily party political, whilst I'm quite clearly somebody who votes Labour and stood for Labour and was elected as Labour and led the Labour Party. I'm no longer in a political party, and the John Smith Centre is a non-partisan organisation with a cross-party board. We've got representatives from the Conservatives, Labour and the SNP sitting on our steering board and guiding our work. So I think all of that is quite important context to offer up at the start of this. Now, I've been asked to talk about how you influence public policy and how you get evidence into the policy making process, both from my perspective as a former politician, but also from an academic perspective. And I promise you I will do that. And looking at the attendee list for today, I understand that you're an audience of practitioners, of policymakers, of researchers and citizens who all have a really broad interest in improving health and reducing inequality in whatever form that it exists. So perhaps much of what I'm about to say might be familiar to you, but what I'm hoping to bring is an analysis over the top of the statistics that will at least provoke you into thinking about your own operational style and the impact that the work that you're doing is actually having, and whether there's anything you can do to tweak or to rethink or restyle your work to ensure it has that greater impact that the attention and the effort that you've put into developing this work actually deserves in the current political climate. So as I say, I'm going to talk very specifically about housing and looked after children with the focus on one being an example of the complexity of whole system change, the other being on how rare long-term policy making is and how desperately we need governments to take the long view when it comes to developing policy. And I'm going to try and start by explaining why I don't think that happens at the moment with 5 overtly political insights. And these insights are drawn from the work of Professor James Mitchell and Professor Ailsa Henderson, who are both political scientists who look at political behaviour and voting patterns, election behaviour. I'm also going to draw in some recent polling that's been done and some of the work we've done at the John Smith Centre and that we amplify at the John Smith Centre around trust. And I'm also going to incorporate some of my own writing that I've been doing, looking at the SNP's electoral winning strategy in the context of what it means for policy. So we know the SNP are excellent at winning elections, but what does winning elections mean in the context of developing good public policy? What's that relationship between public policy and the political process in the round? So those 5 key points or key insights I'm about to make broadly go like this. Firstly, Scotland is not as radical as it thinks it is. Secondly, multi-level governments and competence issues dominate excuses and reasons why things don't happen. Thirdly, the Constitution is the only game in town. It's literally the only game in town that every single public and social policy issue is seen through the prism of, and that can be really debilitating and polarising and paralysing of the public policy making process. The fourth point I'll seek to make is that big tents rule. So we are in the business of having a government who wants to build big tents, bring as many people into the co-production process, into the development process around public policy, in part so that responsibility can be shared, but this really slows things down and it makes really radical, different, groundbreaking ideas very difficult to implement because you don't want to upset anyone. Every radical idea has winners and losers, and the losers right now are very unhelpful when you look at the third argument, which I'll make about the Constitution being the only game in town. And finally, I just want to reflect on trust in politics generally and why the degree to which people have faith in the political system around them affects public policy making and affects the political process. So starting with that first one, we are not as radical as we think we are. In fact, if you're going to describe Scotland in a nutshell or in a phrase, and this is drawing on the work that Professor James Mitchell's been doing, looking at how people vote in Scotland and what their views are on big public policy issues since the 1970s, it's a better way to describe us as being more anti-conservative than we are progressive radicals as a nation of people. And, you know, looking very closely, particularly at Margaret Thatcher, the attitude of Scots to Margaret Thatcher in her time in office was, in a way, it was in a way a very dangerous thing to say. It was economically positive, but politically it was deeply negative. So actually the reality was that public spending went up under Margaret Thatcher in Scotland, and that Scots liked some of the policies that she offered, particularly around the sale of council houses, policies that we know were absolutely devastating and hugely destructive to eradicating poverty and inequality and giving people a safe and secure home, a legacy which we're still dealing with now, that we're trying to resolve and reform now, many decades on, but something at the time we need to understand and acknowledge was popular. And that has set in train views of how we view ourselves as a country, our own identity and our own view of the world from that point onwards. And you can see that in some of the polling that was done in the late 1980s, where actually Scots had turned on Margaret Thatcher by that point, but not for the reasons you might necessarily think. They just thought that she didn't consider Scotland to be very important. And she actually, she thought that Scots were second-class citizens. So that anti-conservative sentiment was building right through the 80s, but that's what it was. It wasn't a case necessarily for progressive radicalism or a greater state intervention or a huge amount of support for centre-left or even left politics. It was anti-Thatcherite and it was anti-conservative. And that led a lot of people to argue or support devolution to stop Thatcher at the border. That was what they thought that they were doing. It wasn't necessarily that they were building a more progressive country. They thought they were protecting the welfare system. They didn't necessarily think that in voting for devolution, they were going to deliver a radically different, more progressive welfare system. We need to understand that story about ourselves, and that's something that Professor James Mitchell is really, really keen that we get into the details of. And actually that idea that Scotland sits in the centre and centre left is demonstrated for elections over the past few decades. I would argue until I was blue in the face that the SNP represent the centre ground of Scottish politics, and they win by building a coalition of voters from the centre and the centre left. I think it's very difficult to argue that the SNP as a party are progressive radicals in any real sense. People want to challenge me on that if they want to offer up ideas of that or examples of that. I'm very happy to go there in the Q&A, but that is the prospectus, and I think it's evidenced by some of the research there that I'm using or pulling from James Mitchell based at Edinburgh. The next thing I wanted to look at was multi-level government and the degree to which competence has grown as a salient issue in terms of how people vote. So we're 23 years now to be exact into devolution itself. So I think the Scottish population now understands that they have multi-layers or levels of government. They know that there are councils. They know that there is a Scottish Parliament. They know that there's a UK government that all has direct policy implications and governs public services that relate to their lives. But they don't necessarily know where responsibility lies. They don't know what the difference is between a power held by local government and a power held by the Scottish Parliament or indeed by Westminster. And that ignorance, let's call it that, to be blunt about it, creates some insulation for policymakers, because there's a very decent, salient escape hatch from blame from any under-delivery, because people will blame all politicians, or they can't necessarily pin down which particular politician or which particular parliament town hall is to blame for that inactivity. So do coalitions, coalitions that form at local council level or in the Scottish Parliament, whether that's in a formal coalition or in a confidence and supply arrangement, or the degree to which minority administrations have to appeal to other parties for votes, kind of dilutes the degree to which people know where responsibility lies. The buck is passed around the system as a consequence. It's really interesting right now to look at what's happening across Scotland's 32 local authorities after the recent local government elections in terms of the pairings between political parties that are forming. Very few formal coalitions, lots of minority administrations, which are in every other form coalitions without the name, because of the degree of partnership and stability that's required to function properly as administrations. The public do believe that the SNP manage the economy well, but they don't know to what extent the SNP have any power or control over it. So again, if things are to go wrong with the economy, they don't necessarily blame the SNP for that. And again, we can deliberate or debate the degree to which the SNP or the Scottish Parliament has economic powers to really drive the structural change that we're talking about. The single most successful strategy that the SNP have applied in the past 15 years is their ability to stand up for Scotland and to establish standing up for Scotland as what we call a valence issue, a competency issue. And actually that now comes ahead of competency on any other domestic social policy issue. So whether it's the management of the economy, as I've just referenced, the health service, education, housing, whatever the domestic agenda is that you can point to and say that is a responsibility of the Scottish Parliament, the SNP have managed to establish a competency issue being whether or not the Parliament and the people who govern it are actually using it to stand up for Scotland in the context of UK-wide politics. So every time an election is framed in that sense of which party is best placed to stand up for Scotland, if that's the competency question that's set, then the SNP win. And the SNP win handsomely, having won every single electoral contest since the referendum and many before it, and with double-digit leads, because that is how they've been able to define the contest. Now that leads us to a situation where the Constitution is the only game in town. And I think it's fair to say, and it's hard to deny, that Scottish politics is utterly polarised and paralysed by the continued constitutional debate and the current debate about whether or not there should be a second independence referendum. Now let me explain why that's the case. 45 to 50%, depending on the poll at any one given time, of people in Scotland support independence. It moves up and down that spectrum of 45 to 50%. But that 45 to 50% pool of voters is shared predominantly by the SNP and to a lesser extent the Green Party. And yes, of course, there are other political parties that stand at elections and represent independence, but they rarely make it into electoral terms in terms of seats in council chambers or across the Parliament. So there is a pool of votes there for the SNP, which they are largely in competition with the Greens for, and it represents 45 to 50% of the population. That delivers consistently 40% support for the SNP in an election, and that means that they win. Meanwhile, on the other side of the balance sheet, when it comes to the Constitution, so to speak, 50 to 55% of people across the country want to stay within the United Kingdom. But that shared pool of the vote is shared between three political parties, largely the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats. And that leads to tactical voting and a contest amongst those three parties to be the most pro-union, to be as pro-United Kingdom as they possibly can be, and to knock each other about a little bit in order to establish that as their main selling point, because the only thing that matters in the electoral context is the Constitution and where the party stands on that. But that consolidation of a pro-UK position between those three major political parties stops a second independence referendum from happening, because that's in the gift of the United Kingdom government. And that is what's creating the impasse. Now, I want to mention just a couple of other things that I think are really relevant to the degree to which the Constitution influences public policy making and our politics more broadly. Some really interesting evidence from the Scottish election study that demonstrates that 90% of yes voters, so 90% of that 45 to 50%, are centre and centre-left voters. And actually, even more interestingly, of the people in the past couple of years who have moved from no to yes in the context of the Constitution, and there has been a marked shift as a consequence of Brexit, 88% of the people moving from no to yes are centre and centre-left voters. And I think that's really important to consider in the context of the policies that political parties use or develop in order to court votes. It's in the interests of political parties in support of independence to develop and promote policies that require a social democratic outlook. But at the same time, people who support independence have to be careful not to demonstrate that the Parliament can do lots of amazing, ambitious, progressive things, because why then would you need independence? It suits in some ways those who support independence to make an argument that if you want a social democratic utopia, if you want a democratic socialist country, however to the left you consider yourself to be, you have to vote for independence in order to get it. And there's a serious debate to be had about the degree to which the Parliament, the Scottish Parliament's powers, which have increased over recent times, have really been maligned in order to deliver that message. And I'll give one example later on of where I think a campaign and evidence and a coalition of people in the third sector working together managed to defeat that. But it's very hard to point to many others. For the most part, it's in the interest of the governing party to say that the Parliament doesn't necessarily have the powers that it should, that it's not in the interests of the Parliament to prove its radicalism now, because that might, for example, prove that the Parliament is working and delivering in a way that is unhelpful to the wider constitutional debate. So I've said a little bit there about the political context. I just want to move now on to talk a little bit about the political strategy that's being used across the country. And at the top there, you can see the history of the polling around independence there, and just how close we are as a country, or how divided actually we are as a country when it comes to the constitutional debate. Utterly polarised, 51% to 49%, and just how close that gap is. And the widening of that gap in favour of one choice over another is what dominates so much of our political debate. Now, here is a groundbreaking revelation. I'm sure you've all joined this seminar this afternoon to wait for this moment. The SNP believe in independence. There's a shocker. It is their guiding mission. It is their purpose. It's the ideological and philosophical frame through which everything is therefore seen. That shouldn't be a surprise to us. They're also established and excellent campaigners. As you see, we've just looked at the figures. You can see from that graph there has been a move from people moving from no to yes in the aftermath of Brexit, and the SNP consistently win elections. That requires an enticing vision of independence, one which appeals to the centre and centre of left voters. The reasons for that I've just articulated. One which requires there to be an active state, one which wants to eradicate poverty and inequality and accompany that with prosperity and economic growth, which can then be redistributed and shared, allowing everyone to benefit from it. But that vision of how to achieve that radical future, or at least a future free of poverty and inequality, requires not upsetting anyone. There needs to be a big tent built where people are brought in, where policy is co-produced, where working groups are set up, where people can have conversations, where things can be deliberated and shared and slowed down. The product of these working groups are recommendations, many of which are produced and have no afterlife. They sit on shelves only for the next working group to be established that might look at them, might not. It's very difficult to see how often recommendations from these big reports are actually applied, who's accountable for them, what the consequences of not picking up the recommendations are. And I will say an awful lot more about accountability in a little while. And this setup of creating the big tent, coming up with the ideas, publishing the ideas, I think is at the root of the creation of what we now refer as the implementation gap. Because what we've done is we've generated a consensus around on the agreed rights that individuals should have or that should be established, but the delivery of the duties in order to make those rights real gets stuck in a vortex. And that vortex might be financial. It might be there's not enough money to make that change happen. It might be a vortex of responsibility because it's not very clear who the main delivery agent is supposed to be, who shares power, who shares responsibility, who shares the blame. And all of that comes down really to a lack of any serious accountability mechanisms that exist around these policy development processes, even when they get to the point of being enacted. And that, I think, is a big thing that needs to change if we're going to get out of this cycle of being stuck in this implementation gap. And as I've said already, it's very hard to do anything radical because anything radical has big winners and losers. Take, for example, the Scottish Parliament's tax powers, in which for a long time remained unused, and they've been used in recent time to slightly moderate the thresholds that income tax applies at. So people who earn over £41,000 a year in Scotland will pay a higher tariff of income tax than people south of the border. But it doesn't generate huge, substantial sums of additional money that could be spent to transform public services in Scotland. They're not insignificant sums, but I would argue they are largely symbolic. They're not the necessary sums that we might want to see generated from tax if we really wanted to transform public services. That's in part because if you use those tax powers more radically, there would be winners and losers. And some of those losers would be people who you are currently trying to court towards the cause of independence and a different constitutional future. So if you're not prepared to use the tax powers to increase the amount of revenue that you have to spend on new progressive ideas that are going to tackle poverty and inequality, then you have to look at existing budgets and look to repurpose that spend. And that really means cutting something. And whenever you cut something or deprioritize or disinvest, whatever your preferred terminology is, you create a lobby against you for that. You create people who are going to defend the status quo, who believe that that particular item that's been identified as being surplus to requirements has worth, has value that needs to be defended. And again, you're creating more losers, you're creating friction within that tent that you can't afford to lose. And I think there's a really live, good example of that just now in the context of the government's relationship with trade unions, having the support or at least neutralising the trade unions in the context of the independence debate is a hugely symbolic and important thing for the Yes movement to achieve. Bringing them towards independence is even better because the trade union movement represents much of that fairer, more equal future that we all want to see. So if you find yourself in a situation where you have to handle a pay dispute like we have just now with train drivers who are on salaries well in excess of the median salary in the country, but who are demanding a 9% pay increase, you have to be very careful about the optics, as politicians would refer to, that creates the idea that you as a government are falling out with the leading trade union, what that looks like to the public, what that means for the independence cause. But at the same time, you have to be mindful, particularly in this dispute, because it's the first of many in the current pay cycle, the precedent that settling that pay dispute might have for wider public sector pay in general. So for example, if you give the train drivers 9%, it flows from that you may well have to give teachers 9%, nurses 9%, university academics 9%. And the more and more that the wages go up, you have the compounded impact of that on salary bills well into the future, and you have even greater pressures on your spend and revenue spend, and you have to work out what else you're going to have to pay down in order to meet those future salary bills. And just finally on that point around the big tent, that strategy works, but only in a time-limited fashion. And the end point for the big tent strategy is, of course, trying to achieve that second independence referendum. And if that doesn't happen, well, then what? And this is something that's very much on my mind at the moment, because of course the gift to have a second independence referendum is not in the First Minister's. It would require a Section 30 order from the UK government. And I've been arguing in a long essay in this Sunday, the Times from this Monday just passed, I wrote it on Sunday, that actually if that second independence referendum doesn't come to pass, then all of this approach, all this very clever political strategy of the past 15 years leads us up to a cliff edge, after which point I really worry for what might happen from that point onwards. Or indeed, it might be the point where we suddenly as a nation start to do the radical things that we currently choose not to do because they're too politically difficult, because they might have those negative consequences. So just moving on to trust, and then I want to start talking about the story of devolution in the round, and in particular housing and looked after young people. Look, in a nutshell, we've always had low levels of trust in our politicians and in our public servants for as long as records have existed. That has been the case. That's not necessarily a bad thing. If you think about countries that have high levels of trust in their politicians, they're not necessarily countries that we aspire to be like. You might describe Russia in that instance. You might describe other countries as dictatorships where you see demonstrably high levels of trust in politicians and public servants. Skepticism is a good thing. Of course it is. It's a healthy part of a democracy. But there is certainly a level to which political trust falls that becomes dangerous, and the consequences of that could be very serious. So if people don't trust the government to enough of an extent that they want to abide by the laws and behaviours that we're all asked of within society, that's obviously going to have material consequences. And I think the pandemic was a really good example of what could happen if we didn't trust the people that governed over us. So trust has always been low. It took a significant dip in 2008 at the last economic crash. It took a further dip after Brexit in 2014. And there's every suggestion, although there isn't concrete evidence just quite yet, that the second job scandal, which was a major feature of our political debate at the tail end of 2021, and Partygate, which has been the dominant political issue of 2022 and is right on the front pages and on our TV screens tonight, could see a further dip in trust. It's also increasingly unequal. So women, young people and those in low incomes are increasingly distrustful of their politicians and public servants, and more so than the average white, middle-aged, middle-class man. That should really worry us as people who are interested in reforming public services, believe in good public policy making, particularly where it involves the use of an active state, because those are the groups that are most exposed to public services. They're the groups of people that most rely on public services, and we want them to work for that particular cohorts that I've described. There's been polling in January of this year that says that 82% of us believe our members of parliament are corrupt. 82%. And actually 50% of us are more convinced that's the case than we were a year ago. So there's a great deal of antipathy between the public and their politicians at the moment, which has consequences across the public policy making process. It's also important to note that that applies to politicians in all jurisdictions. So whilst it's most evident in the UK Parliament, it does apply to the Scottish Parliament and indeed to local councils and town halls. Although it is also the case that the closer you are to your politicians in geographic proximity, the more likely you are to trust them. And the more likely you are to trust them if you've actually met them. It follows from that you're far more likely to trust your local councillor if you've met them than you are Boris Johnson, and that's what the evidence tells us. But here's the thing for me that's important about Partygate that we're seeing on our TV screens tonight. It is not the case that this is a political issue is only damaging Boris Johnson or only damaging the Conservatives. There's early evidence to demonstrate that this is an issue which is impacting on all politicians across the political spectrum. And actually the public are not that surprised by the behaviour of the politicians. They're very angry, they're outraged, but that's not necessarily driving any behavioural change in how they vote, because bluntly, they didn't expect any better from their politicians because of those levels of trust that I've already articulated. Now, that should also worry us, in part because that analysis will likely suppress turnout, and when turnout is suppressed, it favours the status quo, and that condenses power in the hands of those that wield it already. And it should also worry us, or at least those of us who want to see big state-led public policy change. If we want better housing, if we want an improved education system, if we want a welfare security system that's fit for the 21st century and fit for the 21st century's definition of what work actually is and looks like, if we want to tackle ageing demographics, if we want to tackle climate change, then an active state, I think, is unquestionably critical to that. So people having faith and trust in the institutions of government is really, really important. And perhaps in the Q&A, we can get on to a little bit about how you try and rebuild some of that trust, which will clearly be a really slow burning and very difficult process. So moving on to devolution itself. Now, this is the bit where you could arguably say is quite provocative in this, and I'm sure there'll be people watching this going, that's not fair, I don't agree. But bear with me. What are the big achievements of devolution? I'm throwing out some visual images here just to get you thinking about this. The top half of your screen represents policies that were introduced between 1999 and 2007 when Labour and the Liberal Democrats were in power. And the policies at the bottom of your screen are from 2007 onwards, when the SNP have been in charge either in their own as a minority administration or indeed now in confidence and supply with the Greens. And what I'm going to say here is I think there are very few examples of, in the history, 23-year history of devolution, of serious structural and institutional change happening. Two examples I would offer where it has happened is on land reform, so eradicating much of the feudal land system, land ownership, driving community ownership, particularly in island communities, that you can point to as being serious structural and institutional change. Another example might be some of the early legislation the Scottish Parliament passed around mental health, which essentially closed asylums and institutions and focused on care in the community and in trying to create the mechanisms by which people, particularly with mental health conditions, could be cared for within a community setting. That felt like a hugely important institutional change in the early days of devolution. But then I'm going to say, I'm not sure an awful lot happened beyond that in terms of serious structural institutional change. We often refer to how important the smoking ban was in Scotland's development, in Scotland's kind of devolution story. Of course, it had a big impact on public health, but you could argue that the impact it had was much more cultural and societal than it was institutional in any real sense. Moving into the bottom half of your screen, what I see here is a number of policies which I support, or at least I'm not opposed to, but were expensive, symbolic, carried a compound cost, which means that they increasingly draw a bigger percentage of the balance sheet of revenue spend within what the Scottish Parliament has. And the greater the amount that we spend on it, the more we should be examining the degree to which they alleviate poverty and inequality. So what I've got represented on the screen there is the baby box, inspired by Finland, a really important aspect of child development and tackling child poverty policy, without question. But it's very far from the whole picture of what we need to do to address child poverty. Free prescriptions is another one. Free university education, to what degree does that really address endemic poverty and inequality in the country? And things like abolishing the road tolls, increasing the revenue running costs of much of our road network, and how that is now maintained as a consequence. So these all carry a compound cost. I'm not arguing against these things. In fact, I've got a lot of sympathy for the argument that these types of policies create a social contract between the government and the people that says the more that we pay for our public services in the form of our taxes, the more that we'll get back. We will pay higher income tax in Scotland, or at least some of us will, who have the means to do so. But in return, we get things out of that system that people elsewhere in the United Kingdom are unable to access, like free higher education, all the rest of it. I just want to put the point to you today that actually the structural institutional change that we really need to tackle poverty or inequality doesn't happen, because it would inevitably create winners and losers. And we have a government and a governing style that's not in the business of there being any losers, because that involves losing support for independence, or it involves stepping away from that constitutional frame, which is in the DNA of the governing party. I also think it's really difficult to deliver structural and institutional change when you have perpetual election cycles in Scotland. Literally every year well, 8 out of the last 10 years have been election years, and that creates a scenario or an environment where it's very difficult for political parties to advocate ideas which might be difficult in the short term but have really good long-term benefits. And I think we see that across a lot of wicked issues, particularly climate change is a great example of that. Look at the debate that we're having, or about to have again, about camo, and whether or not Scotland should, in the midst of an energy security crisis, still be tapping into its own oil and gas supplies, if there's any degree or merit by which you can do that and still advocate for net zero by 2040 at the absolute latest. A lot of the big difficult decisions around achieving net zero, like the phasing out of petrol cars, gas boilers, heat pumps, the whole rural dimension of stepping away from fossil fuels, are all extremely difficult issues, which, if they're not grappled with, I think will fall victim to that multi-level government setup that I've described earlier today, about being able to apportion blame to different parts of the system, always being able to step away from some of the big difficult decisions that we really have to take in the next 5 years if we have any chance of achieving the targets that we need to around climate change. So just going to move on now to look very specifically at housing. So these are more in-depth examples of what I'm trying to talk about here, about how difficult it is to affect change and how, or what we need to do to turn that around. So as I said at the start, I have a really strong, passionate interest in housing as a public policy issue. So let's have a look at the story of housing over the past 23 years of devolution. You think back to 1999, what was the Scottish Parliament talking about when it came to housing? Well, it was the state of the housing stock, how poorly people were being housed in the system that existed at that time. And the balance sheets of councils meant that they had so little money, they weren't really in a healthy, viable financial position to borrow money. And that's where the idea for stock transfer came from. So to take that housing stock off of the public sector balance sheet in order to generate the funds required to rejuvenate the housing stock. And actually, from 1999 into the early 2000s, a tremendous amount of work was done in improving the quality of that housing stock. By the time that we got to 2002, 2003, The major issue at the time was rough sleeping. And from that debate around rough sleeping came what was then now referred to as the 2012 housing commitment, which we will mark the 10-year anniversary of this year. And what that means in practice is that we've seen rough sleeping vastly reduced across the country, but that doesn't mean that people are suitably housed. In fact, we have extraordinary levels of people living in temporary accommodation at the moment, and the rights to be suitably housed within 7 days are breached on a daily basis, sometimes in great numbers, to the point where organisations like Shelter are taking local authorities to court in order to try and make these rights, which have been legislated for, real in practice, because the duties that those rights create are not accountable for in the system, or it's not clear who's accountable for it. And it's certainly not clear what the consequences are when those rights aren't fulfilled. From 2007 onwards, there's been more of a focus on tenants' rights, stopping evictions. The debate now is about rent controls. Arguably, we've got some of the most progressive rights for tenants in Europe, but that doesn't address the whole of the wider housing crisis that we face as a country. And the story I think this tells us is that we only ever in Scotland see the immediate problem in front of us, and that structural inequality is incredibly rooted in. And what we're trying to do now, it really is to mitigate it rather than address it. And James Mitchell refers to this as the politics or the process of managing decline. Now, there are some policies in there that are making a difference, like second home council tax, empty home levies, but they're quite small fry against the immensity of the challenge that we face. What we've never done in Scotland is actually build the houses that we need. And now we know that is the answer, that we have to build more social homes, and we're discovering that answer. We're building the political consensus for that answer at the time where the barriers to doing it have actually never been greater. Because the reality is that Brexit and what Brexit's done for labour supply, the situation in Ukraine with regards to raw materials, building standards being higher as a consequence of the demands of climate change, all mean that the true cost of building a house is going up exponentially. But the median grant level, the housing affordable grant that people get in order to build those houses, isn't keeping up with demand. So £160,000 is what we used to think the actual cost of a house was. Now it's nearer £200,000. And the reality is the government support just isn't there for that. So I think it's nigh impossible for the government to achieve its 2040 targets around house building. And within that, the commitment to ensuring that 70% of that is affordable supply, I think, is really under threat. So there are some ideas and solutions, and many of the people watching this call will know what some of the answers are to that. There's some really interesting ideas and solutions coming from the Republic, where you have Sinn Féin in the Republic of Ireland arguing, given the same context that they're faced with, they're going to stop building or at least subsidising mid-market homes, and every penny that they have as a government to spend on social housing, they will spend on social housing, 100% social housing. Because the reality is that if you want to reduce the need for affordable housing, you need to take money away from areas that have that demand for mid-market rent. You need to move the debate away from home ownership schemes. You need to change the development model. You need to look at where the risk is carried when it comes to house building. You need to look at how you can free up funds to spend or to borrow to build houses. And all of these types of policies have losers. And all of these policies will upset some of the people in that tent of consensus that's been built around that political strategy for the constitutional change that's required. So I think that a big part of that is about building consensus for change. And that's what we're trying to do at Shelter, is build consensus for the need to build social houses. So that's my assessment really of why it's so difficult to have this big drive of public policy change, particularly using the powers of the Scottish Parliament. And the one argument against that is the recent success of the campaign of the children's charities to increase the child payment to £20 a week. And I think that goes against the grain of much of the other campaign and work of organisations in Scotland just now, because there's universal agreement amongst the sector that was the answer within the powers of the Scottish Parliament to try and address child poverty with the powers that the Parliament had. There was a united front from the third sector. They used it in a sustained fashion over a long period of time, and they created a political problem for the government if they didn't do it, because they proved the Parliament had the power, they proved universal support for something they could do with that power. it was irresistible. The government had no choice but to do it. Another argument you could say around addressing structural ingrained issues in the housing policy area is that maybe you think you need things like the power to alter capital gains tax in order to restructure the housing market. And then that's an example of an excuse that's used not to act. That actually that type of serious structural change is only possible with independence, and that files into the excuse category. So that is the example that I would offer you around housing. And I'm going to now just go through care and care experience, and I appreciate I'm getting close to the kind of limits of my contributions before we go to your questions. But let me just say something about care experience. And I do this as a member of the Oversight Board of the Promise, which is going to publish its first report on the progress which has been made towards the promise tomorrow. Actually, you're not going to get any insights today on what that says. It's embargoed until 7 in the morning, but I just wanted to say I think it's going to be a really live political issue from the tail end of this week, and I want to give you some reflections that I have on that for you, just in the context of this public policy process. If you're not familiar with the issue, we have around 17,000 young people in the care system in Scotland, young people who've been systematically failed throughout their life by a variety of different institutions, agencies, individuals, family members, you name it, they're consistently failed. And actually, at the point that I was elected and started to get engaged in this issue in the Scottish Parliament, I was able to count up 19 different reports that had been published in the history of devolution about the care experience community, all full of recommendations about what should be done to change their life chances, all of which remained on the shelf and very few were enacted. I actually think the case study of care experienced young people is the best example I can offer you of the preventative spend agenda and why it matters to front load public spending on this particular cohort of young people to avoid the consequences of what will happen to them later in life without that support, whether that be their access to the criminal justice system, whether that be the likelihood of them ending up in the homelessness system, whether that might be, as I'm about to share with you, leading to an early death, or just not achieving the potential that we know every child in this country should have. And this brings us, I think, onto the importance of data, and to an audience of public policymakers and academics who deal in data. They will know how important data is and how important collecting the right data is. And my argument to you today about care experienced young people is we simply don't count the right data about their lives. For example, we can tell you how many of them die far too early in their lives, in their teens and in their early 20s. Care Inspectorate reports on that, and I've got a clip there on the screen there of a Care Inspectorate report providing the figures on that. But we don't collate any intel about why they died. Where they died, yes, but why they died, no. Or we don't really collect in any systemic, consistent manner any detail about what their lives were like before their death and the quality of that life. That has got to change. One of the big demands of the promise is that the care system, and I'll show you the care system in a second, keeps siblings together within it. So if you have a brother and sister that are kept or taken away from their birth parents or their primary guardians and put into the care system, there's an awful lot of separation of siblings because the places that they go to can only accommodate one of the two or maybe more children. And of course, there might be circumstances where you don't want to keep siblings together, but where they do, the system fails them. We have no national data about how many siblings are kept together or kept apart. We have some local data. Local authorities do collect this to varying levels of degree, but there is no consistent reporting that allows us to create a national picture. That needs to change. Same when it comes to housing. We know how many people are unsuitably housed in Scotland. We don't know how many of them are care experienced. We don't know how many care experienced people are in temporary accommodation right now. We don't know how long they've been there. We don't know how many failed tenancies they've had before they got there. We don't know how many are couch surfing. There's so much about them that we don't know. So how can we address their policy needs? And then school, which is another really good example, I think. When it comes to data about care experienced young people in school, we collect how many of them get excluded. I can tell you how many care experienced young people are excluded each year, but I can't tell you what their attendance records are like. I can't tell you in any consistent fashion what they've achieved at school, what they've attained at school. Again, some of that's collected at different local authority levels, but it's not collected in any consistent fashion that allows us to paint a national picture. And even 2 years after the promise being published, that is the case. And I think that's of deep regret. And it's definitely something that the community of people on this call today can do something about. So I said I'd show you the care system. That's the care system. I've been a little bit cheeky, and I hope my friends at the Promise won't get me in too much trouble for this, but this is a page from the report that will be published tomorrow. There's nothing in this which is revealing anything secret or anything that's embargoed. It's just a graphic that we have in the report, which is our attempt to properly map out what the care system looks like in Scotland, and how many different agencies, institutions, departments, people are involved in providing services for the care experience community. And you can see, I hope, from looking at this honeycomb of a mess before you, why accountability and progress and radical ideas are just impossible to implement, and why working groups get set up, and why things are neutralised or stepped back because of the need to keep as many people on board for as long as possible in the public policy making process. No wonder children get lost in this system. No wonder children are failed by this system when you look at it as it appears on your screen today. So I just want to close by trying to offer a little bit of an insight into what I think this community of people needs to do. And I'm afraid it's not particularly enlightening, because I don't think there are obvious answers. If there were, you would have them already. But what I think is important from what I've put forward today is that political context of analysis of why there are no easy answers. And if we're all more accepting of that political context, we might be better placed to try and challenge it. We might be more interested in trying to do the things to drive up trust in political systems that is so required, and to get to the point of having social and public policy with an active state that we really need in order to tackle poverty and inequality. So in many ways, what I'm arguing for today is just to keep on keeping on with the work that we're doing just now, because there will inevitably have to be a moment where this constitutional paralysis that we're stuck in ends. Whether that is the event of a second independence referendum, or whether that is the event of it not happening indefinitely, and the question somehow in some other form being answered that I can't quite see, but you'll find people certainly within the Conservatives and to the right of the political spectrum arguing that it simply cannot dominate forever. My next argument about how to influence is really for academics and policymakers, and particularly people within the third sector, to work more closely together. And I think the Glasgow Centre for Population Health is an excellent example of this, where I've seen them work and co-produce work with third sector organisations, evaluating policies that have been introduced at local and community level, being able to demonstrate the impact of that, and then using that evidence to influence national change, where you have leaders who are willing to hear it and willing to learn from it. And if it can't be done at a national level, then surely it can be done at a more localised level in another area. So what we need are more campaigning charities and more campaigning academics. We need active citizens in our universities applying their research and knowledge and expertise in an active form. It doesn't just end when that research is published. We need to amplify and become activists for the policies that we're advocating for, that are rooted in the evidence that we put forward. And then the other thing I think that researchers and policymakers need to get much more concerned about are the metrics of accountability, how we measure the effectiveness of a policy and whether we are measuring the right things. If we only ever measure how many care experienced young people are excluded from school, then we're never going to have the right aspirations for what they might be able to achieve in their lives. And of course, there is great work happening in this area in the country. We've got the whole national performance framework. We've got the whole concept of the wellbeing economy, a new idea, a new way to measure economic growth or prosperity that's shared amongst all citizens. But I don't think we have the proper mechanisms to account for that just quite yet. And what is it that people on this call can do to make sure that we're measuring the right things? And when we have the right measurements in place, then let's talk about the accountability mechanisms for those measurements. How do we make sure that we can build accountability into our public policy processes, which isn't about a culture of blame, that creates a culture environment where risk can be taken because the failure of that risk will not be pinned on one particular person at one desk in one organisation, but it's a collective failure of us all, because we have failed to build that consensus for the radical change that we want to see. And finally, just an appeal to make sure that when we're using data, we attempt to humanize it with real examples. The most effective examples of campaigning and changing legislation that I've seen in my time in Parliament is where big data sets, where big scary numbers were made real with a human example that you could put in front of policymakers and say, with these different policy ideas, with these specific policy changes, things can get better. This person's life can get better. Numbers are incredibly dry, we all know that, but that extra attempt, the energy it takes to humanize data with real stories, I think can make an absolute world of difference. So I'm going to stop there, Bruce, and I appreciate a few people were looking to put their hands up or raised their hand already throughout that when I was talking, so I've got no doubt there'll be lots of questions to follow.